Welcome to Laying It Down with Layman, number 2. Today we're talking about Anti Intellectualism, which is the opposition, the fear, the reservations, the hostility towards ideas and intellectuals, for better or worse. Take it away, Layman.
It's a very intriguing concept because you can come at it from a lot of different angles, right? In the developmental sense, there's this sort of story about the liberal modern intellectual that we've been dealing with for a couple of centuries, and they're menaced on the one side by regression through kind of pre-rational, symbolic, traditional thinking. But they're also menaced by this advance into some kind of post-formal progressive intellectualism as well, which they often conflate with regression. And they also have their own pseudo-intellectual tradition. So there's several types of anti-intellectualism, and several concepts about what an intellectual might actually be. So that intrigues me. And one of the funny things to me is how emotional a topic intellectualism can be for people.
Yeah, it's far from simple. And the more research I do, the more complex it seems to get, right? Because it always begs the question, well, who is the most intellectual and who is anti-intellectual? And what it comes down to in the first instance is this is a kind of paradox because of the tension between knowledge and power. And this is super interesting to me because my field of political sociology, my understanding of it is sort of framed by kind of three kind of theses, which is, it's the study of the relationship between politics and society, as well as between elites and masses, and then finally between knowledge and power. So the way all those things interrelate is a endless kind of dialectic, and it's very interesting but frustrating too. And so with intellectualism, it's like the more you get closer to power, right? Like if you're an advisor to a president or something, or you work for a powerful think tank and you have funders or a company, the more your ideational will and your intellect, your critical faculties are undermined and compromised. And so you have to be aware of this distortion effect. And the flip side of that is the more intellectual you are, the more critical you are of society, of institutions, the more you'll get pushed away, right? The more you're a threat to those institutions. So, you want to kind of have a trade-off because you want your knowledge to be instrumental and applicable and, critical in reforming the world. But there's a fundamental tension there, right? Because a corporation that's driven by the profit motive will have an incentive to instrumentalize knowledge and suppress criticism and dissent. So that becomes another form of anti-intellectualism.
Well, we see this going all the way back historically, as far as I can tell, right? There's the sort of the court-friendly intellectuals, and they have the benefit of being listened to and of being sustained and supported by the system. However, they lose a certain power of ongoing critical insight that the remote or exiled philosopher always used to have, so that he can be more pure and come up with better ideas, but he's in unstable circumstances and can't necessarily get those ideas into anyone's minds until centuries later. That dynamic is really powerful. And it's a funny thing with one of the dangers of being the thinker on the inside is that you can end up being really anti-intellectual yourself in a lot of ways, that you're succumbing to fads that are on the one hand kind of a flocking behavior within the institution, and on the other hand driven by the power structure of the financiers of whatever that system is, so to speak.
Yeah. And yeah, I like how you say it goes back, through time. It really does, sort of to the origins of of philosophy itself. But of course, the contemporary sense comes from the 1960s, from the Hofstadter book, Anti Intellectualism in American Life. And I discovered in my research, there's other sources that predate it, so the concept had been discussed for some time. It's always interesting to try to, locate when these ideas are first formally discussed, and how they become articulated in time. And we're of course we're talking about it because of how relevant it is today. And so there's parallels in the Hofstadter book with today, but there's also differences. So uh, yeah.
One of the interesting things about the Hofstadter book to me, aside from the fact that it's almost like he doesn't have a thesis,
Yeah.
he's got the castle of intellectualism, which is never quite defined, and he goes around it and just examines every different apparent attack group that might be going at it from very different angles. But one of the neat things I thought was the stuff on the education system, because that's simultaneously an intellectual and an anti-intellectual phenomenon, this early American attempt to, say, universalize high school. Because on the one hand, you get an overall increase in the education level of people, but because most of those people didn't want to be there and have to be there, you get a decrease in the intellectual specialization of the educational institutes. And so you get a lot more people focusing on football and cheerleading and all that kind of stuff, because you have to accommodate people who aren't intellectuals and don't want to be there. So that's another one of these simultaneous ambiguities that arise in this area of study.
Yeah. That's an interesting take, because I never thought of it of, appealing or appeasing other people's interests, right? Like sports and stuff, like that's a positive take. But I always thought of it in negative terms, like the education systems are largely to, create a certain standard of intelligence, not necessarily intellect, and to, foster conformity and kind of that, type of just complacency and obedience with the system, right? And some schools are more like that than others. um but yeah, education, it is this balance, because it's difficult to incentivize the critical intellect, because it's predicated on that incentive being there for education in the first place. And education arises not necessarily as a kind of a beneficent thing, but as like an obligation. So I wasn't the greatest high school student for exactly these reasons. I was kind of directionless and all that. But by and large, from a functional standpoint, the education system is trying to prepare you for the job world, for working. And so necessarily they'll train you in an array of things, of which philosophy and critical thinking doesn't play a role at the high school level. And also what you're saying about the Hofstadter book, it's true. And I was reading a review here from a few years ago, and it says the book is a work of a great mind, but it isn't a great book. And I thought that was funny, because I think it is a great book, but then it goes on to say it's too meandering and episodic. It doesn't tell one story or make one argument. So that's kind of what you said, like it doesn't really have a central thesis. And what's interesting about it is that Hofstadter is a historian, right? So this and his other books, he's packing it with data points and publications, and it's chronicling the kind of evolution of these things in different segments of society. So I think it's incredibly useful in that sense. But then we can also take this retrospective approach and think of it critically. So a big takeaway from this review is that it said, Hofstadter wasn't a radical, he was a liberal. And I found that really interesting, because you can kind of read the book both ways. If you read it as a radical, it's very, very, you know, subversive and all that. But you can read him as a liberal too. But at that time, he seems to be a much shrewder and more critical liberal than the liberals we have today.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that's his identification with classical liberalism, right? And a lot of the book and a lot of his interest is obviously in the 18th and 19th century origins of a lot of this stuff. And the kind of liberal he is would have been quite a radical at that time.
Right,
So
right.
he identifies with that. Today we might say that kind of liberal is maybe holding the system back at this point, but it definitely was moving the system forward earlier on. And when it inherited a lot of the classical educational tools to enable it to do that function.
Yeah, it's really a double-edged sword, right? And this is where, like, I am a radical, and so I want to make this distinction important. So the book is great, but in retrospect, you might notice the absence of a serious discussion about like race and stuff like that, right? It's not that it's totally absent, right? Like he's kind of woke for his time, but as some of the reviews and stuff indicate, like the literature about the discourse, as it were, about race and gender and related things, was still pretty fresh, was still pretty young, it was still evolving. um and so he was just on that cusp, like he should have known better, like he could have drawn off like the black tradition in sociology, because there's lots there, but he didn't. And then there's a point here in this review that um that he was against the student radicalism of the 60s, right? So that was just coming online as the book was being published and intensified after. But that kind of surprised me, um because there was a reason. Like the student radicalism was, I would say, motivated by intellectual concerns and anti-war concerns. So his dislike of the student radicalism is its own form of anti-intellectualism.
Yeah, I think that's true. From the sort of integral developmental perspective, he strikes me as what we'd call mythic rational, right? Or somebody who's pretty advanced in their cognition, but their maybe moral, emotional system is a little bit more traditional. Like he's emotionally ethnocentric, even though he's a very good intellectual. And so where he's mining his intellectual material from is entirely tradition, entirely white men, and
Hmm.
he's
Hmm.
emotionally very suspicious of any of the new changes going on. You read
Right.
that in his final chapters when he deals with John Dewey, right? He's very mentally sensitive to the value of Dewey's ideas, but he always wants to mention at each step his feeling that people went too far with this.
Yeah. Yeah. um and just more to zoom in on this point, like he was kind of negligent of this race and gender stuff, but he throughout the book he really highlights the New Deal, right, the progressive era, as a huge intellectual leap forward, and that it actually had to get intellectuals on board, right? It was a debate, of course, and I touch on this in my article Solidarity in the Darkness, which reviews Michael Brooks's book. And because there's a quote from Arthur Schlesinger about how classical liberals, right, had to really evolve and transition during this time, right? So at first they were opposed to the New Deal, but they had to concede and they had to support it, and then the New Deal happens, right? And so we're still pushing for a Green New Deal today, and that's that is threatened and undermined by this sort of anti-intellectualism, right? So the classical liberals, instead of holding on to this nostalgic ideal, they need to come around and actually ground their intellect in today's political scene. And so, these things have to happen. Like, part of the New Deal is, or the Green New Deal, part of it, or by extension of the Sanders platform, is like things like education reform, right? Radical education reform, like debt jubilee and free college. And so, I mean, this is the practical foundations of an intellectual society, right? And what we have instead is that's been completely undercut by 50 years of neoliberalism and longer of just this trend of anti-intellectualism.
Yeah, there's a very subtle form of anti-intellectualism within what we might assume is the well-educated liberal establishment. And there's a kind of postmodern critique, which would say something like, the nostalgic value claims of the liberal intellectuals were never quite as serious as they meant them to be, right? Maybe they're sentimentally attached to these ideas, but they're behaviorally attached to a system that uses those ideas to keep itself going. But that's also the opportunity for change, like it was with the New Deal, which is to say, once the machinery starts to turn, their embedding in power makes them jump on board, because their principles aren't as serious as they've claimed, right? They're only partially in favor of free speech. They're only partially in favor of individual rights. They're only partially in favor of fairness and equality. They're actually very much embedded in a power structure. But if you can turn the ship, their commitment to power means they'll just jump on the new one.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there's opportunity there.
Yeah. I wish I almost wish it weren't the case, because you have these people who like, despite better judgment, they stay popular as public intellectuals and thought leaders. And so I'm thinking of conservative intellectuals, and there's they have to come around eventually. And there's a bit here in this review, like the 80s especially saw a kind of boon for conservative intellectuals. And says here, help turn intellectual conservatism into such highly consequential policies as supply side economics, deregulation, originalism in constitutional law, and neoconservative foreign policy. Like, I can think of critiques of all of those things, right? Like, those are intellectual ideas that have disproven themselves, at least by today. They've had negative consequences. And so we see public intellectuals, and I use that phrase in quotes, but like David Brooks of the New York Times, right? He's been a feature of the New York Times for a long time. And, he's been wrong on many things, right? Most notably, like the Iraq War. But, he can just keep going and having his opinion column because he's so established. That being said, he very slowly evolves, so it's like, I'd rather get rid of him, but we also want him to come around, and support this change, right? So there's an inherent tension there in the relationship to status, and careerism. Like, what do we do about that? Because they're sucking up the oxygen and preventing other intellectuals from rising and debunking and critiquing them. It becomes a kind of unhealthy, what's the word? not coagulation, but kind of, everything just kind of stagnates and dies.
It's tricky because, like you say, those people have a lot of capacity, right? They're currently entrenched in something, and they're prominent and promoted because their ideas, however much they progress, do actually support the existing power structure. And that can place a limit on the development of new ideas and new patterns that are good for people. So they're dangerous, but they're also good. There's an opportunity there, which is that we want to enfold them somehow, right? Ultimately, you want to figure out a way where everybody's aligned on your project, but at the same time, they're holding a lot of things back. It's a very suspicious situation. Now, one of the things I'd like to do in this conversation is really get into subtle ways that intellectuals behave anti-intellectually. I'd like to get into maybe what a definition of intellectual authentically should be so that it could operate at different levels. But I'd like to take a minute and emotionally ground it for myself in a couple of things I remember from being young. And like one of them was really young. I remember talking to a kid out behind the barn trying to explain something to him, and he got upset. And I was trying to be helpful, but he accused me of doing a smart person trick.
Mhm.
These were his words. And I tried to explain it to him. Maybe I did a good job, maybe I didn't. But instead of trying to follow what I was saying, he recoiled into a position where saying a complicated statement was itself some kind of attack on him. So that's my first anti-intellectualism memory. The
Yeah.
second one is I remember a girl running out of math class in tears in grade
Mhm.
11, right? The abstraction of it and maybe the way of teaching wasn't conducive to her understanding, but it became emotionally overwhelming. She was cut off from what seemed to be a completely unnatural system to which she had no way of entry. That
Right.
was interesting to me. And another one was a night, I think it was a Christmas Eve party. My brother started going off against philosophy. And I was like, that's a philosophy, though, right? You have a very complicated intellectual position against these people you think are the intellectuals. You're the intellectual, right? You're anti-intellectual in the sense of being an intellectual who thinks intellectuals are their enemy. There's a lot of that in Hofstadter's book, but you can't you can't be anti-philosophical without being philosophical because that's a philosophical position. And he got very upset, had to leave the room, was sort of seething. It should triggered something very deep in him. So for me,
Yeah.
these are my personal touchstones on this topic.
Yeah. There's a lot there. And yeah, I'll try to pick up off just the main things. Is like you want to go subtle, which I do as well, because it's almost fractal, right? We can find this problem within ourselves and in many pockets of life and learning. And then the other aspect was the emotion, right? And I agree. I believe strongly in this that there needs to be a much higher emotional intelligence to grapple with some of these issues, right? And so and the kind of critiques like, oh, you need to do shadow work and stuff, like it goes in all directions. But um ultimately, being an intellectual critiquing power, those people have to be extra aware of of their emotional intelligence, because they're more likely to abuse the critics, the intellectuals, right? Because it threatens their power, or they can just it's a mental cop out to drop into that mode and project that it's the critic who is emotionally underdeveloped, right? So we really have to be hyper aware, and it's this is a continual reflexive dialectic process, right, of drilling down and of comparison. But in the basic sense of being intimidated by abstractions, there's a lot to go on there, because I think everybody goes through that. I've as I said, I was a bad student in high school. you know um I think on one hand philosophy is very seductive. Like there's this promise of intellectualism, whereas with math or something more abstract and more formulaic, um there's no promise of intellect per se. It's just like computational power. um but the obvious thing maybe to say is like the trope of like the nerd, right? So in school, and in popular culture, we disparage the nerd. They're antisocial, and they're um they're not threatening per se, but we call them nerds because they're interested in irrelevant, tedious details and subcultures and stuff. But it does fundamentally kind of oppose that that jock kind of stereotype as well. But in the spirit of dialectic, like all of these things can be overcome. You know, I believe everybody can be an intellectual to some degree. You know, and so in terms of the levers of change, you know, it like fundamentally we need to have an educational substrate to society that takes care of everybody and takes care of their emotional needs too, right? So these things go together. So for in order for a student to grapple with these difficult paradoxical concepts, they need that full spectrum support.
Yeah, I think that's critical. There's a couple different ways of thinking about an intellectual. And one is it's the person who has an exaggerated mental capacity at the expense of their physical or emotional capacities. And that is something that you see. And I think that might be partly a reflection of the educational and officialization system we've set up in the last few hundred years. I think once you officially stamp people as thinkers, you end up ruling out a lot of the people who anciently were the thinkers, who might not have been that same kind of person at all. But we definitely, there's other definition of intellectual, like in the sense that the school of Athens were intellectuals, or maybe the sense that Descartes was an intellectual, right? He didn't have his ideas about math and philosophy until he came back from the war from 6 years, right? So he was, that's a physically oriented guy. Socrates too was in the war for years. So there's a sense in which people who combine their thinking, feeling, and sensing faculties become what we hope an intellectual should be. And the system should be set up to help that occur as often as possible, regardless of what you want to use your intellect to think about. It should be connected to embodiment and feelings and life. And then if you want to go into abstractions, you should have to feel them, be concerned about them, sense them, and move forward, and not be able to leave yourself behind and just become an abstraction calculating machine. And I know you said there's not necessarily an invitation to intellectualism within math, which is true in terms of the system of math, of just computing things. But one of the things you do get in that area is the sense that there's a history of people who were great thinkers who loved this subject. And you might not get that. You don't get that in gym. You don't get that in even chemistry sometimes. It's kind of vague. But in math, there's a sense of there were these pure, beautiful thinkers who took this stuff very seriously and went out like they left the planet in deep space, and we reaped the rewards later. So I love that about it.
Yeah, it's a bit misleading for me to say that it's not inviting in that sense. I was just never good at math, really, but there is an allure, right? Particularly to geometry, and there's a great book called Geometry and the Liberal Arts, and it kind of tracks the coevolution of those things. And I've always been attracted to geometry, because it's an aesthetic kind of practice too. And it was very, very entangled, or coupled with Plato's Academy, right? So there's that, there's the idea of proof in geometry. And then that, if you take it intellectually, you can sort of map that and transpose that to philosophy. So it's definitely part of the practice of being an intellectual.
Proof is interesting.
Yeah.
A lot of what I do lately is try to think out the mechanisms of modernity that lie underneath the claims of modernity. And lately I look at it mostly systemically, but there's also a way of looking at it as terms of individual subjectivity. And when I think about Descartes and I think about the kind of modernist revolution in cognition, I often come back to just calling it the double checking revolution, right? Where reason, and they all loved reason means double checking your thought. And the scientific method originally was, well, just check it against the evidence. Just do an extra step to check. And that's what was largely missing from the intellectual life of the folk, so to speak, who lived in the kingdoms prior to that, is they didn't double check. They got an immediate hit. If it came with an emotion, seemed practical, we're going with it. That's a fact. And they
Mm.
were very suspicious of these people. Said, no, 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 no. We got to double check. Otherwise, it doesn't count as a fact. So the cognitive thing was an intensification of what proof meant. You had to like get a second proof and see that they had a high level of correlation to each other, which takes extra work and extra effort. So of course, you're going to be a little bit against it at first.
Right. Yeah, and we live in a society that's increasingly complex, right? Almost like we can't catch up with it. Like we study it, but it's running away from us constantly. But I wanted to before I forget, go back to the point about like the early philosophers and um these sorts of things started out as like mystery schools, like philosophy and education in general was always very exclusive, and then it goes through an evolution over time, and starts to crystallize under the kind of monk traditions coming out of the dark ages, right? Because they preserved what little knowledge there was. and then yeah, it co-evolved with power all throughout this time. But now flash forward to today, like there's the advent of things like the knowledge economy, right? Like jobs increasingly move to the service sector and then to the knowledge sector, right? So we're all kind of knowledge producers now, and so you need this, it needs to be universalized. And my sort of ideal theory of leverage here is that you can actually up level a kind of whole population to think more critically. And what the part of the thesis of this book and kind of the related discourses is that it's the paradox is not just between knowledge and power, but the relationship with democracy. So democratizing society and knowledge kind of contributes to this anti-intellectualism, but we should try to reverse that trend, right? We can't decouple them, but we could try to bring them closer together so we kind of have a intellectual democracy. And just to make it complicated again, right? There's no sort of there's not necessarily an absolute consistency to this plateau of intellectualism we're talking about, right? It's always going to be reflexive and dialectical and critical. um and so today we have such a siloization of knowledge and kind of hegemony of different types of knowledge production and discourses, right? So science itself is very institutionalized, very kind of overdetermined, whereas the intellectual traditions are increasingly relegated to the edges of that system, right? Like liberal arts professors get defunded and kind of ostracized until they have no power, right? So it's a point of leverage, to invest in a more transparent kind of intellectual segment of public life and media and discourse, so that we don't have such catastrophic mistakes like the Iraq War, right? So because these are so-called intellectuals that are very instrumentally rational, right? The think tanks, the Project for a New American Century, they're the architects of these wars, and they're not dumb. Right? Like as George Bush, as dumb as George Bush might seem, there's this powerful conservative intellectual tradition behind it. And yeah, it's just gone off the rails in some way.
Yeah, I think there's a real need in a way for the archaic intellectual to return within the current knowledge environment, right? And what I mean by that is a person who has their physiology and their emotion involved, who has something, who is, in Hofstadter's book, there's a real tension between sort of the folksiness and the universities going back through American culture. But they've always liked the folksy intellectual. And as goofy and dumb as that seems sometimes, there's a positive value in that, meaning that they've tried to embody their ideas. Like, it seems like there's a big difference between a person pondering abstractions from their well-to-do drawing room and a person pondering the same abstractions out in the field, so to speak, because you know they're grounding it somehow. Nietzsche said you should never trust an idea that occurred to a person who was sitting down.
Yeah.
And so there's something to that. Um, in terms of the Iraq War, I'm reminded of Nassim Taleb's sort of critiques about negative feedback, right? That those people, as much as you might have learned about a situation, if you're not personally involved in it in any way, if you don't enjoy the rewards or suffer the negative consequences, his point of view would be you actually can't be smart about it if it doesn't affect you. If your kids aren't going, if you've never been to Iraq, if you've
Mhm.
never been to war, you can't know. Whatever you think you know, you don't know about it, because the majority of your intellect is embodied.
Yeah. And I should touch on that too. I wanted to say, like, the mind body dualism and kind of the quest for unity, via yoga or whatever, is perennial. Um and it's what I tried to accomplish, but also parody with my abstract project, because it's fundamentally about like linking mind and body through philosophy and fitness respectively, right? And I sort of I sort of like turn it into a joke and fetishize it, because like you can go a long way between kind of mapping the geometry of the body and the world and thought. But it's also kind of a vain endeavor and kind of ableist. And I always come back to like Stephen Hawking as an example. You don't need to be ripped like Ken Wilber or whoever, because we're all trapped in these bodies, for better or worse. And if you're smart about it, like you won't let it hold you back, right? And there's a kind of, you can transcend the illusion as well anyways of the mind body. So like Stephen Hawking, Helen Keller, you know so there's something transcendent there, intellectualism becomes kind of you know un, under takes on kind of spiritual connotations and kind of infinity. So we don't want to fetishize the mind body connection. And Kant is famous for kind of never leaving Königsberg, like just being cooped up in his loft or whatever, researching, which it's fascinating to me, because they didn't have anything like the internet back then. It's just like, send him books and then he just sits there and meditates on them. And it can go a long way, but fundamentally what it comes back to is there an honesty with the real world, right? The real world implications, the morality of it. And so that's why these conservatives can be so disembodied about it, in the sense that they're not sending their kids off to war, they're sending somebody else.
Yeah, it's a tricky thing to say mind, heart, and body at a certain point. And I think what that gets to is the notion of establishing coherence within systems, within your own systems, because deeper and leading edge thoughts, one of the things those do is bring a whole bunch of your ideas together, right? And the old thinkers were obsessed by this idea of a celestial quality of harmony, and they were right to do. They encountered that in their thinking. But you can also do that between your systems, like your sensory system, your perceptual system, right? Authenticity and the world. Those are things you know about that you can try to work in. And if you can, you get a higher quality of harmonization. So body isn't about whether you're getting ripped while you're doing
Yeah,
your thinking. If you can, that might be a good thing to do. But
right.
it also means you're taking your body seriously. You're checking sensations. You're taking the world of perception that your body inhabits seriously. You're taking other people's bodily realities seriously and how you think about society and politics. You're taking the whole dimension of embodiment seriously.
Yeah. um there's there's a couple good quotes from the book here I wanted to read, like especially as it relates to the subtlety, right? Because anti-intellectualism, I think, is kind of a paradox. You can't just confront it head on. It's a ongoing project, and Hofstadter says here that there can be benevolent impulses behind it, right? So there's many kind of practical reasons to be anti-intellectual, and as I say in this article I'm working on, it could be highbrow culture being alienating, or experts being occasionally wrong or disembodied, and moral dilemmas and cognitive dissonance challenging our agency and sense making, right? So there's all these incentives to um, negate something intellectual. And the quote here is, anti-intellectualism must be excised from the benevolent impulses upon which it lives by constant and delicate acts of intellectual surgery, which spare these impulses themselves. Only in this way can anti-intellectualism be checked and contained. I just like that idea of surgery, so that you're leaving intact the kind of emotional component that rationalizes the anti-intellectualism, but you want to remove the anti-intellectualism and leave everything else. And at some point I wanted to definitely pivot to who are the contemporary anti-intellectuals, right? Like, I've critiqued the intellectual dark web for this, is not least because they stick the word intellectual right in their title, and that's just so self-serving and kind of offensive to more serious intellectuals, right? Like, all of them try to undercut more serious people. Sam Harris tries to undercut Chomsky. Peterson tries to undercut Zizek. And so you can see it on display, the anti-intellectualism. And there's a good point here about piety, and Peterson is a extremely kind of pious person. So the effect, where am I here? The intellectual has a distinctive capacity for mischief, right? Which is great. However, the suggestion of that leads to the consideration that his piety by itself is not enough. He may live for ideas, but something must prevent him from living for one idea, from becoming obsessive or grotesque. And I think this is what happens to someone like Peterson. He just becomes obsessed by certain ideas or certain anti-ideas. So he becomes an anti-Marxist, and that becomes his organizing principle. And it says here, the effect is as observable in politics as in theology. The intellectual function can be overwhelmed by an excess of piety expended within too contracted a frame of reference. And so that's what's happening with Peterson. He just collapses the meaning of all these systems, which are quite intellectual in their own right. Like, Marxism is a very intellectual tradition, right? If we must separate it from the history, because history, like with capitalism is violent and ignorant too, right? We can't reduce politics and history to those theoretical foundations, right? Because you cannot block or censor or disown or expunge those theoretical traditions, right? Because it's evolving and it contributes to a higher order. So the anti-intellectual kind of trend that works through people has this negative effect of trying to oversimplify and trying to negate other concepts, and then here we are. The problem just reproduces itself.
There are definitely some, it's hard to always call them anti-intellectual. Sometimes I'm tempted to call them insufficiently intellectual, and then that's a relative claim. It's relative to where I'd like them to get. So there's obstructions within the intellectual spirit that are, I think, recurrent throughout history. One of them is this tendency to not tease out things that are valuable from the systems they're looking at, but to treat them too homogeneously. Like, For example, here's a good question for Peterson is, what do you like best about Marxist thought? Right? This goes back to what you were saying about surgery is, yeah, of course it's not all good, but it's
Hmm.
obviously not all bad either. Which
Hmm.
bits do you like? What can you intellectually retrieve from there and move forward with, rather than try to point out that it's either all bad or that the people who affirm it are somehow naive morons because they're generically affirming it. And
Yeah.
so that's a problem within intellectuals, is they're very often not teasing out what they need from what seems like a block of thought. Another problem is, a lot of them are compulsively competitive, and that's reinforced in the university publishing system. But it goes all the way back, because sometimes accusing someone of anti-intellectualism is just a way to promote your intellect against theirs. And sometimes, as in Hofstadter, the reverse is true, where you're an intellectual, but you attack intellectuals, and you're trying to put them down at the expense of your brand of intellectualism. So it has to do with this inter-intellectual competitive spirit, which we have to really be careful about if we want to collectively make progress.
Yeah. And what you're saying about Peterson, like it's kind of a kind of a positive kind of Socratic invitation to him, like okay, let's talk about what you like about it. But this is a slippery slope, because by Peterson's own confirmation, he's not read Marx. And consequently, he's not read any of the various discourses of Marx, right? The various Marxisms. And many scholars will say, like, you have to read Marx himself. But then, of course, there's lots of other great derivative works, right, which are almost necessary, because Marx was writing in the 19th century, and it's like, like a lot of the language has changed, and it's just, you can't read these things in isolation. It's great to have the commentaries, the interpolations, but then that can get overwhelming too. So it comes back to having a kind of humility before these discourses. That's the only way we're ever gonna, like, incrementally ascend and raise the level of discourse collectively.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, that's limited by the fact that everybody only has so much time and energy to put into thought processing, even if they're really good at it. So you pick your battles. You might want to encourage someone to go into a certain area more than they have been, but really, we're all going to go into some areas and poke around, and we're never going to get all of what's there. And so we should be ready to we should be encouraged, I think, to look for substructures within those systems, whether we're reading commentary or reading the originals. My own approach is to basically find somebody I like who thinks at a level way beyond me, and then just reread them and keep
Yeah.
pulling out little chunks. I think that's an important approach.
Yeah, and that's what reading this book does to me and for me as well. Like, the book is, over 400 pages, and it's quite tiny text. And so, to prepare for this conversation too, as I said to you before, like, I pulled up a bunch of more recent articles too. And so this topic just becomes endlessly fascinating. Um, but in order to not get too wrapped up in the subject itself, right, you can specialize in this topic, but then it always expands out and connects with other things, like you know the education system, right? That's a whole other kind of kind of kind of paradigm. And as I touched on briefly, like the military industrial complex, right? How is that entangled? And just at a basic popular cultural level, right? What is the relationship between our kind of folk psychology and sociology of the world and the actual relationship of it, right? And how does the media distort these narratives? Because the media has changed so much since Hofstadter's time too. Now we have the internet and social media, so we live, and we'd be remiss if we didn't mention post-truth and Trumpism, because those are things that that came up in my research too, and also just in general. Like, we live in the post-truth era now, right? What does that mean? We live in the Trump era. How did that happen, right? So what, one of the most interesting observations I could make about the anti-intellectualism book, or anything like that, is that it's so great, but despite it, every history happens despite our insights. So there's been this anti-intellectual trend, right? And it's related to the systemic factors like neoliberalism. And so there's anti-intellectualism from masses towards elites, and from elites towards masses, and it's just all over the place. But we have to start realizing at some point that we've created this mess that we're all entangled in. We're all disaffected and tainted by it, right? So it's so pervasive that it infects everything. It reaches into the subfields of academia. And so, through this intellectual surgery, like, it can't just be a kind of fringe project. It needs to be a mass mobilization endeavor, right? So we realize that, Trumpism arose for emotional reasons, for practical reasons, but it's also, demonstrably, like, the most anti-intellectual incarnation yet, right? So we're getting stupider, and a lot of comedy celebrates this fact, right? Points it out. But at some point, and this is an insight from metamodernism, like, the joke is no longer funny. Right? So we get over the emotional hurdle by learning how to laugh at ourselves as a stupid civilization, but then we have to actually, reckon with it. So I'm still trying to, demonstrate the thesis that we have anti-intellectualism even in our intellectual communities, right? These various networks and communities. That's a tall order, but then the next step is to actually, recognize it and do something about it. So that's where we're, hopefully we're getting closer to the subtle truth of what we're trying to accomplish today.
For me, I look a lot at the sort of thought expansion at the surface level, or thought expansion in depth, because one of the interesting things, you go, Black Lives Matter, and some goes, yeah, what about all lives? Or what about, right? They've gone sideways. They're staying at the surface rather than first going down into the concept. And I think that's reinforced. On the one hand, the interesting thing about that is you could then become intellectual hypothetically on any subject, right? And this is one of the complaints of, yeah, why universities? What about trade schools? That kind of thing. Yeah, okay, in principle, because if we need to do what you were saying, which is universalize more intellect, okay, what's actually getting universalized? Is it a standard set of knowledge we associate with the universities, or is it a thought capacity that you could get by getting in depth on any topic, even if that topic was car repair, if you did it right, right? So what needs to be universalized is doing it right on any topic, drilling down. And once you've got in depth, you can then find other patterns of depth in other areas that expand out, and you get this whole different kind of thought expansion. But the kind of tools we're using today, such as, Facebook and that kind of thing, it seems to amplify the surface expansion. You grab a quick thing and you have a quick reaction, and you go to the next one, you go to the next one. So you feel like you're getting a command of what's going on, but you're not getting any depth on any one of those things. And the kind of Trumpism phenomenon is partly a response to those media structures, but it's partly a response to all kinds of other structures where I would say the subsystems of modernity have gone to war with each other, right? So the way you incentivize the administration at the university is somehow sabotaging the modern ideals of what university education should be, right? And then the way you set up your police department to protect modern citizens is somehow sabotaging the free speech and protected rights of citizens. So the parts of modernity are failing. They're incentivized to ultimately fail by attacking each other. So that's a very difficult problem. And if you have that in the media, in the bureaucracies, in the power structures, then pre-modern systems can start to step forward with incredible and unexpected force, like a kind of Trumpism force.
Yeah. um, yeah, the problem is so overdetermined. I like that concept because it highlights what you're saying. Um, like we're like the specialization of each of these sectors, right, leads to this anti-intellectualism, right? So the police itself becomes a force for generating crime and disorder. And there are solutions to a lot of these things, but people looking for the shortcuts, right, however smart they might be, is what leads to these false conclusions. And I can't help but think of the intellectual dark web again. And like Joe Rogan had a clip the other day. He was talking about Black Lives Matter, and the Weinstein brothers and Sam Harris are doing the same thing every day. They're looking at the slogan, and then they're completely ignoring the movement and the leaders and the platforms that are articulating what the issues are. And they're looking at the surface level phenomenon and going like oh, but they don't really know what they want, or what next. Oh, defund the police, like, so what next? They're doing a disservice to that intellectual spirit and work, essentially, that's operating through those communities. So yeah, it's going to require a conscious move of self-criticism, and there's a great source here, and not to go into any depth, but just to touch on it. It's from 1963. The title is "The Enemy Within: Anti-Intellectualism," and it's actually a review of a journal of a symposium that was about anti-intellectualism. And so this precedes Hofstadter, but it's parallel, and this author is basically identifying it as within all of us, and it's fundamentally rooted in fear above all else. And so that becomes kind of the driving force behind it. If we could just recognize that, and we can address that within, and we can address it without as well, in terms of the environments we create for people and the scaffolding for their development. So that would be my injunction to contemporary intellectuals, because it is to myself as well, to be self-critical, to be autocritical. And that doesn't mean that you hold off forever on making a decision. It means you hold off just a little bit longer than the next guy. And so you achieve a little bit more accuracy and resolution to your synthesis or your critique, right? And so the broad point I'm always coming back to is like, well, where are the sociologists, right? Why aren't we having that discussion, right? Why are these conversations being driven by psychologists and economists and people who are consciously specialized in fields that have nothing to do with what's going on?
Yeah, that it is very suspicious that the sociologists are not as prominent as you would expect when the problems all seem to be sociological in nature. That almost seems like the system has an immune function trying to prevent them from entering the discussion a little bit. The dark web is intriguing because each of these people is a really good thinker in some area. That's where they start from, right? So you got, Eric Weinstein's critiques about the embedded growth function and the collapse of the universities. That's a pretty good critique, right? Peterson's good on some areas of psychology and mythology and meaning making. Great. And on top of that, you got to give them credit for trying to branch out and explore new areas of thought, which they're trying to do. But somewhere along the line, there is a sense that they got captured by something or are going too slow. And so from the meta-intellectual point of view, you want to say like, how could we help them make progress faster in some of these areas so that they end up with a convergent set of generalized insights that we could mobilize on. But in terms of the enemy within, the fear thing is interesting, but I would join it with like a hope thing. I was thinking about Star Wars. And, I loved it as a kid. And I remember Han Solo, yeah, never tell me the odds, right? Don't sully my instincts with
Yeah,
statistical information.
yeah.
I believe in the Force as a non-rational capacity for me to take immediate action without thought. That's what's going to give me victories. And to some degree, that's true, because ultimately we have to have good instincts and we can't be trapped in calculation. But at the same time, that's a bifurcation point where you could either be moving towards a more comprehensive, intuitive practice where you unite statistical information with your instincts, or you could be offlining your thought and just going back to what Kahneman calls system one. You just think the fastest, easiest thoughts are the magic ones that give you power. And I think there's a
Mm,
lot of that in Trumpism, but there's a lot of that everywhere, right? There's a lot of that in when you see a grotesque version of somebody who's like a progressive and they're out screaming, the kind of things that would turn off the intellectual dark web, these sort of exaggerated, unreasoning, apparent voices of progressive ideals. And they're sort of saying the right thing. They're just saying it from a high-speed rote place where they haven't done any real thinking on it. So
yeah.
all over the board, people are falling for the easy thought as if it gives them magic power because it doesn't cost them as much thought, energy. So it feels good. So it feels like magic. So maybe it works.
Yeah. I love the Star Wars reference because um not because it's popular, but because I think there's something deep and profound there. And I've written about it to explore this idea, but it's the nonviolence, right? So it's literally called Star Wars, like it's a movie about war, and it's actually kind of true to his history in the sense that the empire is the Nazis, right? They're this very monolithic, uniform kind of bureaucracy, and the violence is, of course, kind of concentrated and repressed into their weapons and their mandate to control and control the universe. But that's very anti-intellectual, right? And what you're saying about the Force, it's a non-rational, mystical energy, right? But I could make an intellectual argument for what Luke does in the end, which is chooses not to fight. And so it's beautiful because this is a very atypical storyline, right? Like most hero myths end with the kind of hero slaying the enemy. um and so Star Wars subverts that, and I think it's kind of ahead of its time back in the 70s and 80s because it all builds up to the climax, right? To a cascade of climaxes where, I mean, ultimately they do destroy a lot of shit. They blow up the Death Stars, but Luke, in the final instance, right, he chooses not to fight and to sacrifice himself. And not only that, right, it's taking a leap of faith because he doesn't know that it's going to work, right? We never know. And so it does work in the movie. This is what makes it so mythical and transcendent, is that his sacrifice actually ends the war. And so that's the big takeaway for me, is like, my intellect is organized around that principle, which you can't really make an intellectual argument for at the end of the day. It's kind of a divine principle that reaches back to our archaic roots, and mythopoetically creates a situation where we can kind of transcend the paradoxes of our life, the things that drive us into conflict. So
There's a split there, I think, right? Like the archaic revival in general consists of maybe half a return of non-rational but intelligent capacities and faculties being recognized, and being recognized in a way where they could help you move forward towards some kind of trans-rational balance. But then the other half is they're being affirmed as they were anciently, as a way of not needing to put any work into reasoning. Um, there's a higher and lower, there's a stupidity involved in courage, always, right? Because it's a gamble. and yet life is a gamble. So you have to take that seriously. You have to make that gamble. However, there are really dumb ways to do that. Right? I think of my ancestors, some of them, the Scottish clans of the Highlands, who had the kind of tribal idea of the berserker, of courage. Right? You let your mind go and just totally let yourself flow as a force, an emotional, muscular force of courage, and you believe the right thing, right? And they were just wiped out. You can go there now and just see the acres of fields where these clans were mowed over by the British Army. They didn't have a chance, right? Their bravery was retarded. But on the other hand, all bravery has to be dumb at some point. It's a subset of stupid brave acts are the exact right ones to do. So it's another area. There's so much of this sort of
Yeah.
bicameral ambiguity about every one of these anti-intellectualism topics.
Yeah. And there's, there's an inherent tension there with militaries and, intellectual critical traditions, especially dissent. And, ostensibly militaries want to, you know, um make their own jobs obsolete, right? They want a peaceful world, but it's fundamentally maintained by the kind of flow of history and fear. um but we're if we speak of kind of the awakening today, it's not necessarily the way the awakening is the realization that we want to get rid of that paradox of war. And a lot of people, whether it's through kind of the traditions they're in, or the pressure, from the paradoxes of games and game theory competition, they don't want to let go of the military option. They want to achieve peace through military, but it's becoming increasingly clear, right, because of climate change. We should talk about that too, that the real enemy is ourselves. And like, it's not each other. The real enemy is kind of what we're doing, right? And so another thing I'm trying to unpack in this research is climate change denial has been such an overarching systemic form of anti-intellectualism, right? Sort of a deep generator function of all social problems, because we've known about climate change for over a century, like approximately 120 years, right? Since the turn of the 20th century, really. And instead of, because this is such a abstract, ephemeral kind of a scientific fact and insight, and it can be ignored. And so dealing with it threatens industrialism, it threatens the profit motive, and and our politicking. But it's fundamentally an existential threat, bigger than war, bigger than world wars. And so it's ironic in retrospect, right, if we think of these things intellectuals, because all throughout history there's intellectuals dissenting. They're dissenting to the absurd, violent flow of history, because they believe ideally that they can intervene on it, or at least that we should. And so I'm making the point, like, it's so absurd that we kind of, in retrospect, wasted time fighting world wars when we should have been mobilizing for world peace and for addressing our impact on the climate and the consequent effects that are coming down the pipe. So as it's becoming increasingly well known how systematic this process of denial has been. There's books and documentaries, and they expose the think tanks that existed to produce climate change denial, and they expose the actors and the thinking that drives this kind of denialism. So coming back to emotions and the psychological level of all this stuff, is we have to deal with denial.
Yeah, and I mean, my first thought again is about how the derangement of the subsystems of modernity here, because one of the functions of modern civilization would be to preserve and protect itself, right? It has these modern military defense forces, but it hasn't been deploying them against its major threats. And part of the reason is that its media and sense-making apparatus is turned against that because it's incentivized to do false equivalence and promulgate conflict, right? So it doesn't matter if you got 99 people on one side, one guy on the other. What you want is to throw them up against each other as if they're equal so that the whole audience can get stressed and polarized and tune in again tomorrow. So there, the modern media system undermines the modern defense system. We end up fighting threats that aren't the real threats. But somehow behind all of that is this notion like of thinking fast and thinking slow, right? Which is the fast mind, which is the instinctive mind, which is very cognitively efficient. It's excellent on things where it's had a lot of personal experience that went the same way and provided immediate feedback, right? If the feedback is too late, or if they haven't had personal experience, there isn't a lot of use of system one. You got to think it out carefully with system two. And longer ranges of time are system two affairs. But nobody's repeatedly experienced the climate change thing, right? You didn't go,
Yeah.
well, I lived in 12 cities and I went there and immediately there was a flood. And then so I instinctively know it's a problem. So because we don't get that at that cognitive system, and we're reluctant to use the other cognitive system, we're always torn. Even the people who are pretty good at using system two, when they're relaxed, when they're tired, half the time they're tempted to switch to system one as well. Fuck it, I don't care. Who says this thing's going to kill me?
Mm-hmm. That's all true, but it occurs to me that the kind of primordial myths of civilization are the flood myths. So we've been through humans have been through a climate change catastrophe.
Sure.
and that has failed to guide us, and so we're coming up to a new threshold, right? We're in the liminal phase where all of this past history gets kind of jumbled and reinvented, if you will, because all of it has led us to this disaster too, right? So all the religious traditions, all the philosophical traditions, while they have immense value, they've also sort of programmed us to just fall short of that intellectual, minimum viable kind of zeitgeist, right? And so it's always the hope with social movements and political revolution that we're reaching tipping points, right? And the new tipping point is not just business as usual, like let's expand rights for people and let's fix the economy. It's no, we need a kind of global transformation of everything, of the idea of civilization, to really transcend these perennial problems once and for all. Because all the different forms of anti-intellectualism, right? And there's three main kinds that Hofstadter writes about, and another author kind of crystallizes just to bring it home: religious anti-rationalism, populist anti-elitism, and unreflective instrumentalism. So I think all of these forms kind of like reinforce each other. They're antagonistic, but they also reinforce each other because it always gives people a place to go to be anti-intellectual. Right? So it finds at least three major expressions. But we need to synthesize those things like religion, politics, and reason itself, so that this doesn't happen. This entropy of critical thought doesn't happen.
Yeah. So, what comes up for me is like strategies about how we solve that whole tangle, right? So part of it is intellectualism needs to be extended, right? People who are already good at it in some areas need to be empowered to escape the cul-de-sacs that they get into so that they can keep extending it. I think it needs to be authenticized in the sense of being more embodied. And I think more connected with our deep instincts, right? So you've got to do the work to connect your archaic instincts with your new information. And that's personal work, and you got to undergo the conflict and get out the other side. It's not good enough to just be system one or system two in the Kahneman sense. You got to think there's a system three, which consists of my intentional work to make those two make sense with each other, so that I don't just know things, I can be moved. And I don't just get moved, I know things. Like Hamlet's dilemma still haunts us, right? When he's calm and can think about things, he doesn't do anything. When he's worked up, he can't think. That's the story of
Right.
Hamlet in a way, right?
Right.
The other part of it is you need extended, authentic intellectualism, but it needs to be empowered and centralized in the culture somehow. Not so centralized that it loses its reflective distance, but central enough that it can move things, speak to people, and stand out as something valuable for us all to work on. And I think there have been a lot of, like the social body has rejected them to some degree, but I think also intellectuals haven't understood how you get in a little more. Like you were talking about nerds earlier, and it made me think of, in Hofstadter's book, the kind of critique of the unmanliness of the intellectual that was going on in the 19th century.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of intellectuals don't understand that some of that is just part of a hazing routine, like a gate to see if you can come into the society. So if you say, well, you're an intellectual, that means you're unmanly and effeminate, you're interested in culture and ideas like a woman would be, right? Like from that person's perspective, to a certain degree, the correct answer is you just say, says you, faggot, or whatever, right? You join them at that crude and critical push level, because that's the membrane. They're saying you got to pass this. This is the gargoyle at the gate. And
Yeah.
I always found that reasonably easy to do in my own high schooling, but I always saw a
Yeah.
lot of other smart people not know that they could push back at that moment on the same terms, and then they would be more friendly to you after that.
Yeah. No, that's a great point, and that's exactly kind of explains the dynamic between me and Jim Rutt, and as well as these other people that I criticize. Like we don't have to go into that, but that is precisely the point, because I'm acutely aware of my own knowledge gaps and shortcomings and anti-intellectual inclinations, right? And so that I think is what enables me to just be more authentic and critical. But with Jim Rutt, it's case in point, because he's delineating certain rules for engagement, and they're very aggressive. They're very masculine, very authoritarian. And so I don't see any way to kind of just succeed by going along with that. So I try to meet him where he's at. I clash, and I try to break through his anti-intellectualism, because it's so transparent that that's what it is. Like he's an extremely intelligent person, but he's decided certain areas, certain intellectual topics are off limits even for him. He doesn't want to read it. He doesn't want to go into it. So, I'm critical of other people for their, not just their ideas, but for their actual embodiment of it, their engagement of it. And how do they treat other people that they deem as, not professional enough, or some other form of anti-intellectualism, right? Like if I'm critiquing their intellectual work or capacity, there one has to be defensive, right? And wonder, oh, what's going on there? That guy must be anti-intellectual. So it comes back to the subtlety of it, and sometimes it's not so subtle in the case of Jim Rutt, but it becomes a competition of who's the better surgeon.
Subtlety is fascinating to me, and it makes me think of the dialogue around subtle energy, because I've known a lot of people who are practitioners in that area, and the Hofstadter's point about instrumentalism comes into play for me, because I very often sat with someone who can produce very interesting effects in themselves or other people, and I want to say, how do you tell the difference between subtle energy and placebo? Or do you mean specifically bioelectromagnetism, or do you mean an additional energy of some kind? And 9 times out of 10, the answer is, it doesn't matter, it works. I'm a healer, right? And you're like, okay, that's fine, right? You seem to be doing some good work here, but it's odd to me that you don't even want to address the question, as
Yeah.
if you don't have time for it, or as if your powers might fail if you inquired. But I think really they're saying it's so delicate an area, they just don't feel comfortable. They don't feel it would be worth their time to even try to negotiate a really delicate point. And so there's an anti-intellectualism that even among smart people holds back from harder and less tangible problems.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how to follow up to that. But one thing that comes up is, like, obviously the type of subtlety you're talking about, like, it seems like a cop out. Just like, I'm not gonna address the complexity because it's gonna undermine my assumptions, my convictions. But, like, I like this idea, like I said before, whether it was before we started recording, but the fractal nature of it, right? So you can endlessly zoom in on the problem and get higher resolution, and that's useful, right? And maybe there's diminishing returns to that, but for the most part, I think no. I think it's useful to, like, zoom in as much as you can, and zoom out as well, kind of get the micro macro synthesis. And yeah, try to break through this. We're trying to do something transcendent, but at the same time not vain, not self-deceptive, because it's very easy to delude yourself with kind of spiritual inquiry and pseudo intellectualism. Right. So I mean, the world is so complex and the different fields are so complex. You can easily fall into these traps and just thinking you're smart. And this is how conspiracy theory operates. There's so much material out there, and then you kind of become a kind of detective of it, but you're just a victim essentially of the complexity. You're just endlessly following these dead ends, as you say, cul-de-sacs. So this comes back to how this is a kind of mass education and public health issue. We need to demystify what it means to be an intellectual. That's part of the kind of top line of the article I'm working on. It's like this issue is already, like, mystified to hell and back, but we need to try to demystify it, to pull back the veil and show what's really going on. um and it's difficult because it's not enough to say intellectualism is about ideas and values as opposed to more concrete things, but that as you say, with embodiment and with experience, like, it's anchored in the real. So we need to keep coming back to that, keep coming back to problem solving, but not through denial or repression, right? Like, there shouldn't be this idea of at the expense of, we're gonna create order in society, but at the expense of dissent. or vice versa. We're gonna create, I don't know.
The zooming in and zooming out. I mean, that's one of the things Vervaeke talks a lot about, is you're modifying the scale of your cognition because you're looking for what's going to give you an optimal grip in relationship to the actual circumstances you're dealing with. But I'm also thinking about the endless zoom. If you ever watch one of these computer things where they, like, just run a Mandelbrot set fractally,
Yeah,
right? And so
yeah,
you're endlessly nuancing it. You're going in and in and in. But the interesting thing is you keep seeing the same shape repeatedly as you do that. And so then that can become a stable organizing principle, right? You don't have to hold back on further exploration. If you just keep going uncertainly into that cognitive dissonance, you will find some repeating stability that's in there. It takes a little courage to start, but it's not just a passage from the known into chaos. I
Yeah.
thought your mention of conspiracy theory was really good, though, because that's something people point to as the anti-intellectualism of the moment, and it's partly, it used to be very colloquial and based in a few books, and now YouTube makes conspiracy theory information really accessible, and that's partly because I think there's no trust in the system, right? There's no useful mythological awareness, so people are trying to make up a mythological system of their own to restabilize. But partly there's a passivity in that form of gaining information, right? You can watch a lot of YouTube videos without doing any active thought. And you think that because you heard a lot of stuff and can maybe repeat it, that
Yeah.
basically you know it now, but you didn't do any contemplative thinking. And there's a big difference between active thought and mental activity. So that even when the meditator says you got to, don't be so in your head, so to speak, they're correct, but they mostly mean your automatic associative reactive thoughts based on whatever you heard regurgitating themselves. They're not really talking about what the philosophers used to do, which is spend some time going to work on a thought, trying to have an idea, trying to find out what actually is this beyond what it seems to me to be.
Yeah. And when you go away and do that work, you abstract, you withdraw into yourself and away from society, that can be prone to error as well. So, an idea that's influenced me a lot is consilience. Like if you're learning things and becoming a knowledge producer, you don't want it to be, again, at the expense of the broader consensus on knowledge, right? You want to try to add to it, but also revise it, kind of a revisionist approach, and get a higher resolution consilience across it. And so with conspiracy theory too, that's a tough one, because as we know, there's a cottage industry. There's so much information, and there's low trust in society. So people can have so many different variations on the theme. But to kind of gloss over all of that, what occurs to me too is the anti-intellectualism that goes both ways, right? So we're learning through the revelations of history that there's a kernel of truth to conspiracy theory, right? There is kind of banking cartels and white collar crime and a surveillance state, the military industrial complex that denies its own existence. And so from an academic point of view, much of academia is kind of captured, as we would say, right? Like it upholds the status quo. And much of it, there's a lot of critique within it, but it becomes kind of neutered in the sense that, okay, we have all this literature on the military industrial complex, but it's, we can't really do anything with it. It's not consolidating into a political will, at least not yet. We're getting close, but this is the facade that we're trying to break, kind of collectively, of the will of the people versus the elites that try to guide and shape this momentum. But yeah, there's an anti-intellectualism among sort of mainstream intellectuals to deny that there's any merit to conspiracy theorizing. And again, the Weinsteins pop into my head because they call themselves kind of like, reasonable conspiracy theorists or whatever. And I think they miss the mark too. So, they're identifying the wrong kind of sources of power, and their conspiracy theory is kind of self-serving. But but it's about coming back to that idea of nuance. We want to uncover what the actual conspiracies are and then just move on, leave it at that. But there's all these anti-intellectual forces that continue to obscure what's going on, and to, you know, neuter the critique itself.
You know, what came up for me while you were saying that was actually a sort of idea about interestingness and media, and the way in which the assumption that people lack the prerequisites for intellectual effort reinforces that, right? So, I mean, a lot of people have been talking in the last few years about the way the podcast format exists, right? The way people will watch Joe Rogan for 3 hours, when the previous TV assumption was people won't watch anything for more than a couple of minutes and it's got to be supercharged. So they had an assumption that the average person is incapable of being interested in anything. But that turns out to reinforce the problem because it takes away from them the opportunity to learn to be interested in something. And we do need, that's a capacity, it seems to me, because you need to practice doing it with your mind, but you also need to be like physiologically capable of being stimulated by interestingness. You gotta be like, oh, that's neat. You get into an area and you go, I wasn't even really that interested at first, but once I took a look, I actually found that's a neat idea, and that's a neat idea, and oh, that's a neat idea. That's something that involves your whole organism. It's not just in the mind. It powers the intellect. So we need to be better at that. And I think a lot of people have been given no coaching on how to allow the stimulation of interestingness, but also how to aim it. You know, I always think about these guys I knew in elementary school. We would do this really simplistic new testing thing for spelling, right? So at the beginning of the week, you and a friend pick 10 words. At the end of the week, you test each other, and then your friend reports it to the teacher. So many opportunities for cheating if you want it, right? Anybody getting less than 9 out of 10 is probably not taking advantage of the situation.
Yeah.
There were these two guys, they were getting 2 out of 10 week after week. And I'm like, you could choose the words cat and dog. You
Yeah.
know, your friend could mark you as getting 10. He could tell the teacher you got to, like, they just couldn't do it. And I thought, I guess they have bad memories. But then on the lunch playground area, I heard them arguing about hockey statistics one day. And they knew everything about Wayne Gretzky and Mario Lemieux, like right down the line. I thought, oh my God, they have incredible memories. The only thing they can't do is focus their interest on a topic that they're not immediately interested in. And so the ability to be stimulated by interest, but the ability to intentionally aim your interest, I think underlies a big difference between the intellectual and the non-intellectual. And that's a skill we need to promulgate among people and
Yeah.
encourage through the forms of media that we use.
Yeah, I think Noam Chomsky's made this point too. Maybe many people have made it, but it's that, you know, clearly, like like you say, with sports statistics, clearly the average person has the capacity. And when you really give people the benefit of the doubt and, you know, allow them to you know, practice and thrive and display their talents, I think, you know, pretty much everybody has some sort of unique, special talent or skill that they've developed, and some of it can be quite intellectual. They can get obsessive, right, about the details of sports or games or pop culture. So there's that everyone has the capacity, but then, as you say, with trust, like I think it would go a long way to you know, just by making moves that instill trust back into the public and institutional relationships, like, you know, universal healthcare, UBI, you know, starting the reform process in things like media and politics and education and you know, policing and all these things. It will immediately, in a way, start to pay dividends, right? Like, you know, so there's many moves we have to make at once to foster the conditions for intellectual culture, but then also just make it explicit, which is kind of what we're both trying to kind of tap into at the end, like to direct people to the relevant reality, because you can geek out on the details of history just as much, right? But then we have to be careful not to instrumentalize and fetishize it. And this is, you know, not to be dismissive of conservatives entirely, but this is mostly what I see conservatives doing. They can outsmart me or the left on a regular basis, but it's kind of because they're more tactical, and they're more, just playing for their team, instead of a serious inquiry into history, and specifically kind of the philosophy of history, which would transcend like all of the particulars of, you know how this or that battle was won.
Yeah, and yeah, I know what you mean by the left and conservative, but also those are a little bit ambiguous terms because that problem is exhibited by mainstream Republicans and mainstream Democrats.
Yeah,
Uh, and so a lot of people who think they're on the left aren't, and a lot of that kind of thing. That there's a lot of surgery to be performed in terms of those definitions, because a lot of people who articulate the idea that that's a problem and that they're working on it are actually part of that same structure. I'm thinking about, say, the intellectual dark web. The Weinsteins, they have a lot of really interesting things to say. I always get something out of listening to Eric, for example, and he's a Bernie guy too, right?
he
But that
was
you
he
don't.
was
He
let's be
was.
let's
He
be
was.
absolutely
So
clear.
he's
Not
not
right
far
now.
off, is my point, right? But you don't get that
Yeah,
sense from listening to him that he's
yeah,
in on that agenda. That's not the vibe.
yeah.
He
Hmm.
focuses more on things like why the universities have to be a supportive place for unruly and discourteous intellectuals. And I think that's correct, right? He has a lot of correct things. But how do you get to the place where we could do that? That means you've got to, first of all, depressurize and stabilize the system, right? And so what are the minimum number of general system changes to take the pressure off so that those things can start to flourish? Otherwise, you get this enormous scarcity mentality, small bureaucratic teams capturing all the resources and screwing everybody else and fragilizing the whole system. And if the system's fragile, then it goes down with every new wave, and the waves are going to keep coming. So you need to like depressurize and stabilize. You need universal programs. It has to be okay for people to take that hit, to lose their job. You got to be able to lay off, 10 million people and have it not disrupt the system. That's got to be the setup. You got to be ready for these things that are happening. And when you have that, when you can build a city on water rather than on land, so to speak, then you have the opportunity in the new depressurized, stabilized system to make some of these more interesting advanced changes that the integral people talk about, that the dark web people talk about, right? They run their speculations forward. That's really good. But what is the generalized prerequisite for the kind of world in which those changes could occur?
Yeah, and we have to work a hell of a lot harder to do any kind of transpartisan consensus building. And so what comes to mind with the IDW again is that Sam Harris entertained Charles Murray's ideas, when by and large he's been debunked, right? But however, for me to be careful, right? Like it's not sufficient to dismiss him outright, right? Because Charles Murray is for UBI, right? So there's a point where I align with Charles Murray, but so we have to use this surgery again to, disentangle or, you know, uh, biopsy his racism with the IQ stuff, right? And so this is, Sam Harris might think, well, I'm not being anti-intellectual because I'm actually reaching across the aisle and doing something quite, avant-garde. But on this particular issue of race and IQ, they're both anti-intellectual and they're just feeding into each other. But this is where it becomes kind of endlessly nuanced, because like, you and I can go back and forth about the Weinsteins and what what is the net effect of all the crazy things that they say, or insightful things that they say. How do we separate that? And so for all that we've discussed, I don't think any of those guys are talking about at this level of nuance and fractal resolution, like of anti-intellectualism itself, right? And that's why it arises as such a divisive force in popular culture. So yeah, there's a
It's
lot to excavate there.
it's extra galling to see it when people are close. right? Like they're the same enough to stand out as different, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
Like if I'm at a party and a guy who's 30 years younger or 30 years older than me enters the party, I don't care. But if a guy comes in, he's about my age and looks similar to me, suddenly I'm on edge.
Yeah.
I don't want people paying attention to him. So right, there's this thing that they're like the intellectual dark web and some of these other communities, the integral community, the metamodern community, they're so full of people that are so close to what we're talking about that's where it's frustrating, and that's where the work has to happen, because that's where it could happen, right? Other people who are too far off the map, it's not even of concern that they're problematic thinkers. We're looking for the problematic elements in the
Yeah.
areas that are adjacent to what we're talking about.
Yeah, sometimes you just have to go one level deeper. Like this might be oversimplifying, but like if they have a critique of, student activism, right? One level, and let's say it's valid on the surface level, right? One level deeper, and maybe even the students themselves aren't as consciously aware of this enough to articulate it and change their tactics. But the one level deeper is the economic anxiety that is constricting everybody, right? So that generates these conditions of hostility and anti-intellectualism, right? And that comes back to what I touched on about post-truth, right? Like 2016 was the year that it's not when that was coined. It was coined maybe 2004 or something, right? But but it was the chosen word of the year from a few dictionaries for 2016. That was before Trump got elected, right? So it's kind of prescient, but we're definitely in this post-truth milieu and zeitgeist now, and it's bad. It's bad. We can't just keep joking about it. We actually have to save ourselves from it, to extract ourselves from it. And like with the climate change window, I think we have a shrinking window to deal with it. So there's no way around these things. I'm an accelerationist only in this capacity. In the kind of philosophical sense. I really think we need to break through. And I'm an accelerationist also in terms of like left policy prescriptions. Like the people have demands for justice and demands for basic income and healthcare. And so these to me, we should have immediately. But everything gets politicized, right? So coming back to the basics, the climate change debate, healthcare debate, these things shouldn't even be debates. We can have a sort of consensus in the intellectual sphere, but then it becomes, politicized. So we need to actively depoliticize, and that this is a theme through Hofstadter and the critics of Hofstadter as well. Just whoever picks up on this topic, we have to actively, recursively, reflexively engage in this topic, so that we kind of solve the perennial issue that's remanifesting anti-intellectualism.
The hidden sociological and political drivers of anti-intellectualism need to be rooted out and thwarted.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. I wasn't sure we'd have enough to talk about on this issue, but I think we could go a couple more hours. I haven't even addressed what I call the hypersemantic environment, which is a big part of my thinking on this stuff. But I got to go get ready to have a super privileged white guy beach picnic.
Nice. Yeah. So there's limits, and we have to respect those limits. And as vigilant as I might be, that's dangerous too. I like this concept of hypervigilance. I think I'm hypervigilant, but if you look at Peterson, he's also hypervigilant in a different way, and I think it can be pathological. So we need to be careful about this. And I have this kind of faith. It's kind of like a background noise that real intellectuals have the capacity to reform. And if you can't do that, you're just a pseudo intellectual. You're going to get stuck at that level in one way or another. So it's a constant injunction, but we also can't just wait around. We need to like debate through some of these things. We need to push through them. So perhaps that's kind of close to where we should wrap it up, that like, these things should be debated, but debated with the premise that, you got to be okay losing. Like if you lose your side of the debate, but it's a win for society, then you've won. If you can acknowledge that, if you can take that L, and be okay with being wrong. Cause I've been wrong about lots of stuff. Not so much in the past few years, but in my formative years as a student and as an intellectual, right? You come to terms with, you didn't understand things as well as you thought you did. So this is a constant process at any age and any stage in your development. And I think that's the main takeaway.
I think as long as you have intellectuals who are self-aware of their own evolution and willing at times to engage in self-critique, and that they honor a transcendental truth of some kind that could exceed them and also exceed the other person, then they're available to move forward. But a lot of it depends on good conversations, right? Good sense-making exchanges, which in turn is supported by the right kind of procedure, but also by a skill set in, I guess, what I would call a meta-intellectual, which is what kinds of things do you need to do in order to make it more likely that the intellectual you're dealing with can move a little, How do you tweak the phrasing? How do you approach them emotionally? How do you do the tempo so that their odds of moving are higher rather than lower? Now, that intrigues me a lot. But yeah, I think we're gonna wrap this up for now.
Yeah, the art of persuasion, as it were, is one aspect, and then the self-critical part is be aware of power, how you're serving power, and how power is co-opting knowledge. So on that note, I thank you and the very sparse audience that may or may not be watching for joining us for another session of Laying It Down with Layman.
Not sure how I feel about the title, but always a pleasure.
See you next time.